speaker is Rafał Piotrowski. He is a backend developer in Scala, currently working as part of Iterators HQ, and he is fond of software architecture and design. Rafał, take it away.
Thank you very much. And yes, today I would like to talk about primitive obsession and Newtypes as a solution for that. So I'm working as a Scala developer for Iterators, and yes, we are hiring Scala developers at any seniority level. If you are interested, you can check details on our website. Let's start with defining the problem using some example. So here we have a simple case class. It describes a person. It has just two fields, a first name and a last name, and they are just ordinary strings. And when we want to create a person, we just invoke an apply method, giving to it two values of strings, as you can see here. And of course it compiles, it works, and you can say that, well, this is what we want. But we can also swap these parameters, and this will look like that. We are still giving here two values of strings as the apply method requires, so it still compiles. But I think that this is not what we want here. So if we would have a different type for each field, the person might look like that. And now when we want to create a person, when we need to write a little bit of more code, but here we explicitly say what is the first name and what is the last name. And when we swap these parameters, then it will here not compile. So you can say that it is less error prone because it is more type safe. And besides that, we are able to add some functions or methods to these new types. So for example, we can add some validation or transformation or whatever else we need here. But how can we create or define the types for the first name and the last name? Well, there's a couple of ways how can we do that. And first I will show a few of them. How can this be done using just pure Scala? So let's start with value classes. This is quite simple. We just need to define a case class that extends anyval, and it has one field. This anyval, it tells compiler that a first name should be treated as a string. So it should not be instantiated in a runtime, but the value that it contains should be used instead. Unfortunately, this is not always possible. In many cases, this class needs to be instantiated, so it's not a cost-free solution. And besides that, in typical usage, this kind of types we need to use for JSON data or to write values to database or to Kafka topic or anything like that. And for that, we need to define some special serializers or codecs or something like that. There are libraries that have some kind of mechanism for handling value classes, and there are libraries that do not have any kind of mechanism like that. In both cases, we need to do something to work with these types for database, Kafka, or any other serialization. So it is just adding some additional import or implementation of some interface or trait, for example, a codec in case of Circe or Dubi. So let's try to summarize value classes. They are quite simple, and you do not need to write much additional code. They work in Scala 3 and Scala 2. But on the other hand, they are sometimes not cost-free. And when it comes to deal with databases, Kafka or JSON or other serialization, we need to provide some additional code here with implementation of serializers or codecs. Let's move to the second implementation. This is something that is called tagged types. And here it is more complex. We need to define an empty trait, which is our tag. Then we need to define a type alias, which is type with this tag. And then it's good to have a companion object with apply method, which will give us a convenient way to create instance of a new type. The good thing about that solution is that it is always a cost-free. For compiler, these types will be different. I mean, they will be different from each other and also different from a string. And yeah, let's try to have some pros and cons. Well, this is a cost-free solution, as I said. It works in Scala 3 and Scala 2. But it is quite complex, needs a boilerplate code. And again, when it comes to serialization, we need to provide some codecs, so it needs some additional code. And let's move to the third option. It is an opaque type. Here, you need to define an opaque type and an object, for that a companion object with apply method. And here it is again for a way to conveniently create instance of the new type. So it is a cost-free solution as well. And it has some boilerplate code, but compared to tag type, well, it is more simple. Again, if we want to have some kind of serialization, we need some implementation for that, so we need some additional code. And what is different between opaque types and tagged type or value classes is that opaque types were introduced in Scala 3. So obviously they are not available in Scala 2. Fine, so far so good. We have seen value classes, tagged types, and opaque types. All of that using just pure Scala, so only what a language gives us. But what about libraries? Do we have any that can help us and maybe limit amount of the boilerplate that is needed here? Of course, let's move on. And let's start with a simple library that is called Monix Newtypes. So when it comes to creating a new type using this library, it looks like that. We need to have an object which extends a type from the library, which is called Newtype wrapped for a string. And we, for convenience, also define a type alias. And when we have this definition, we already can instantiate first name, last name, and these are different types. And this is not all, because in Monix, for a new type, we can also add a validation. So, for example, here you can see that it is a title type that will be used for a book's title. And it has defined that title should not be blank. For that, I have extended a different type. So here it is a new type validated for string. And there is implementation of apply method, which returns either a build failure for a title or a valid title. Here is the simple logic for that. In this apply method, we can invoke any custom code we want. So for example, here we invoke the validate method from some object ISBN validator. And this method checks if the value has proper number of digits and if the last digit is a valid checksum for that. And now let's see some simple demo. So here you can see a case class which represents a book. You can see that each field has its own type. So here we have a type for a title and ISBN, so that's the code from the last two slides. Here I have defined a trait for not blank string. This is for not duplicating the code, since here I have other types which are just not blank strings. So I'm using this trait here for publishing house, edition, and language. I have also a publish year, which is a new type validated for int. And here I'm just having a simple validation if the year is between 1970 and 2050. When it comes to creating a book, I'm using a for comprehension, so each field is created separately, and then it is composed into a book here. And as a result, I'm getting either a build failure or a valid book. So let's try to summarize that. This is a cost-free solution. The code looks the same for the Scala 2 and Scala 3, which I mean the API is the same. It has a built-in support for custom validation. It works in runtime, and for validation you need to extend a different type, but still it works quite nice. Monix Newtypes will not add any additional dependencies to your project, and recently there was released integration with Series as a separate artifact, so you do not need to include that if you are not using Series. From the downsides, well, if you are using some other JSON library, not CRC, or some other serialization, then still you need to provide some additional code for that. And also there's a small inconvenience when you are implementing validation. You need to use unsafe coerce method to wrap the value into a new type. So you can see that here in this place, we need to return right of unsafe coerce of value. Yeah, so let's move to the next library. This is Xio Product, and this is part of the Xio ecosystem. And when it comes to creating a new type in Xio, it looks almost the same as in Monix. The only difference here is that we need to extend a different type. It is called here new type for a string. And of course, we have a different import. And in Xio Product, there is no such thing as new type validated. But instead of that, we can define something which is assertion for a new type. And here I have a definition for a title that is, again, not blank. And it uses some regular expression. For assertion, we cannot invoke here any custom code. We can build assertion using predefined building blocks, but still it is quite powerful. And the best thing about assertion is that it works in compile time. So when I define a title like here, the compiler will not let me to create a title that is blank. So because in assertion I cannot invoke any custom code, I cannot use ISBN validator here. Instead of that, I can check ISBN with some regular expression. But if I want to have a full validation also with checking the checksum, I can use another feature of Xio Product, which is called validation, and it works in runtime. So here I have defined an extension method that invokes this kind of validation. And you can see here that I have used a different type. So I'm extending here a subtype of a string, which means that ISBN will be, well, as the name suggests, subtype of a string. So I will be able to use value of ISBN in a place where string is required. And I have used that here. The validate method requires a string, not ISBN. So here I can use that. If I would use a new type as for title, then of course I will be able to use validate methods. But first I would need to unwrap the ISBN value to get a string. And here I can use it directly. And let's see that in action. Sorry. Sorry for that. Here we are. So the book looks the same in here, and we have a title type and ISBN type, which are the code from the slides. Here again, I have defined a not blank string that is a trait only for not duplicating the code, so used for publishing house, edition, and language. Also, there is publish year with assertion. And when I want to create a validated book, I need to just invoke the validation for ISBN and compose a book. Other values are just regular direct values. And I can show that I cannot create a blank string because it will have a compiler error. If that works, but it should, yeah, it's working. So it shows me a compiler error here. So let's summarize that. It's a cost-free solution. It has Newtypes and subtypes. The code is the same for Scala 3 and Scala 2 if you are not using assertion. If you are using assertion, the code is slightly different for Scala 2. The assertions work in compile time, and there are also validations working in runtime. So from the downsides, I have already mentioned this slightly different code for assertion. Also, when we want to use some third-party serialization for JSON or whatever, or some database, we need some additional code. And what is quite important, I think, it is that Xio Product adds Xio to the dependencies. So if you are using already Xio in your project, I guess that's not a problem. But if you are not using Xio and not plan to use that, then it is something to consider. And let's move to the next library. This is called kebs. Kebs is a library for eliminating common source of boilerplate in Scala projects. And kebs is created and maintained by iterators. It has several modules. And recently we have added a new one, which is kebs opaque. When we want to create a new type for Scala 3 using kebs opaque, we define opaque type and also a companion object which extends a type from the library. And here we don't need to define an apply method because it's already implemented there. We can add a validation to a new type, just overriding and while defining the validate method. Here we do not need to wrap or unwrap any value as in Monix. We just return direct values, as you can see. And we can invoke here any custom validation we want, so any custom code, so we can define ISBN with full validation. And let's move to a small demo one more time. Again, we have a book which looks the same. There is a title and ISBN types from slides. Also, I have defined here not blank string, which is a trait used for publishing house, edition, and language. I have again a publish year with the same validation here. And when it comes to creating a book, I'm using here a for comprehension. So each field separately creating, and it is composed into a book here. And to be precise, into either an error message or a valid book. So, well, it is a cost-free solution. It has support for custom validation. It is zero dependency library. Soon we will have built-in codecs for CRC, and probably also in near future we will have built-in codecs for other libraries like PlayJSON, HTTP, and ScalaJack. The downside is that it's only available for Scala 3. But if you are using still Scala 2, you can use a different kebs module, which is called kebs tagged. And here for creating new types, tagged type is used. For that, you need to define an empty trait and a type alias that will use this tag. And this library uses a little bit of magic from Scala 2 macros, so that's why you can see here this annotation. It is also possible to add validation to a new type. So here we have again a title, which is not blank, and it looks very similar to kebs opaque. Again, we can call any code we want here. So we can define ISBN type with full validation. And let's see that here as well. So this is a Scala 2 code, and here you can see the book that is the same as before. And here you can see a type for a title. In this comment, I have put a code that is added by macros, which is not seen here. It is related to this annotation. And you can see that there are two methods added, apply method and from. Both of them invoke validation, which is defined here. The apply method returns direct type, so if the validation will fail, it will raise an illegal argument exception, and the from method returns either. If the validation would be not defined, so in this case, the macro will add the whole companion object with apply and from method returning the direct type, as you can see here. Okay, so let's move on. We have ISBN as on the slide. For the kebs tagged, I unfortunately cannot define a whole trait that will represent a not blank string, but I can extract the logic to a separate function and use that in companion object for publishing house edition and a language. Again, we have also publisher with the same validation. And when it comes to creating a book, again, I'm using a for comprehension, and it looks the same as in kebs opaque. So I'm getting either an error message, or a valid book. Also, for this library, we have a small plugin for IntelliJ, and this plugin does two things. First of all, it adds some information for IntelliJ about the code that is added by the macro. So without that, IntelliJ shows some errors in the editor. And also we have some feature for changing a case class that use primitive types to new types. So if we won't have some such case class as you can see here, we can generate a tagged object for it, and the types will be changed here to the ones that are generated in a separate object, as you can see here. So let's try to summarize that. This is also a cost-free solution. It has built-in support for implementing custom validation. It is zero dependency library. It requires some small adjustment in a build script that are related to macros. It needs some compiler switch to enable macro annotation. But the best thing about kebs tagged is that it is a battery included solution. So it has a built-in codec for various libraries for CRC, Slick, PlayJSON, SprayJSON, HTTP, JSON schema, and Scala check. Also, we have a small plugin for IntelliJ. The downside is, well, that is only for Scala 2. And in the end, I would like to mention 3 other libraries. So two of them are refined with Scala Newtypes, and that's for Scala 2. Refine is a library for refining types with type level predicates. So you can create a type with some constraints, the type level constraints. In this library, you cannot create new types. So you can define that you have not blank string, but you cannot define two different not blank string. So for example, one for a first name and the second for a last name in our definition of a person. For that, you can use Scala Newtypes, the small library. That's why I put them here together. Refine is also available in Scala 3. Scala Newtypes is unfortunately not. And Refine in Scala 3 is not so convenient and powerful as in Scala 2, but let's see, maybe that will be changed in the future. I have also found a Mazboot library that aims to be a solution for refining types in Scala 3. And it has also ability to create new types. So it is, let's say, 2-in-1 solution. But this is a library in early stage of development. So you can take a look, but I would be careful when using that, especially on a production. So let's have some final conclusions. I have shown you how to create new types using Scala features and only, let's say, using language features as value classes, stacked types, and opaque types. And I have shown several libraries, that is Monix Newtypes, Xio Prelude, and kebs. And for kebs, we have two modules, one for Scala 3 and one for Scala 2. So you can ask me, but what should I choose? Well, I think that first of all, it is convenient to use some existing library, since these libraries try to limit amount of the boilerplate that is needed here. And they have additional features, like most of them have some kind of validation. So if you are using Xio in your project, I would check Xio Product. It looks quite nice here, and it fits in Xio ecosystem very well. If you are using Scala 2, then I would check kebs, since it is a battery included solution, especially when you are using Slick or HTTP. You can also check Refined with Scala Newtypes or Monix Newtypes. And the last option is very interesting if you plan in near future moving or migrating to Scala 3, since in Monix that should be quite straightforward. If you are not using Xio and you are already on Scala 3, then I would recommend checking kebs, kebs opaque in this case, or Monix Newtypes as well. So here I have put links to the libraries that were mentioned here, and the last link is a link to repository with a code that was on slides and the code that I show you in IntelliJ. So yes, that's all from my side.